A single watch can cost more than a luxury car. Some rare Rolex watches have sold for over $17 million, making them more valuable than many mansions around the world. Every year, Rolex generates billions of dollars in revenue. Its watches are worn by world leaders, billionaires, athletes, celebrities, and some of the most successful people on the planet. For many, owning a Rolex isn't just about telling time. It's about telling the world who you are. But here's something most people don't know. Despite having millions of customers waiting to buy, Rolex refuses to produce enough watches to satisfy demand. Walk into an authorized Rolex showroom today, and chances are, you won't be able to buy the model you actually want. Instead, you'll be told to join a waiting list. Sometimes, that wait lasts for years. Now think about that for a moment. If millions of people are ready to hand you their money, why would any company deliberately choose not to sell them a product? Does Rolex simply not have the capacity to produce more watches? Or is this shortage carefully planned? Because what if the waiting list isn't a problem at all, but one of the smartest business strategies ever created? You see, Rolex didn't become one of the world's most valuable luxury brands by accident. Behind every watch, every limited release, every carefully controlled showroom, and every record-breaking auction, lies a business strategy that has been perfected for more than a century. A strategy built not just on craftsmanship, but on psychology. Not just on luxury, but on scarcity. Not just on selling watches, but on selling status, trust, and desire. And it all began with a young orphan, who believed a simple wristwatch could change the world. To uncover the untold business secret behind Rolex's billion-dollar empire, we have to travel back more than 100 years, to the man who started it all. The story of Rolex didn't begin inside a luxury showroom. It didn't begin with gold, diamonds, or million-dollar auctions. It began with something far less glamorous: loss. Long before the name Rolex became a global symbol of success, there was a young boy named Hans Wilsdorf. He wasn't born into a powerful business family. He wasn't surrounded by wealth. And he certainly didn't have the advantages that many successful entrepreneurs enjoy today. In fact, before he even reached his teenage years, Hans lost both of his parents. The people who were supposed to shape his future were suddenly gone. Like many children facing such tragedy, his life changed overnight. The family business was eventually sold. The comfortable life he once knew disappeared. Instead of inheriting wealth, Hans inherited uncertainty. But sometimes, life's greatest setbacks become the foundation of extraordinary success. Rather than allowing hardship to define him, Hans focused on the one thing nobody could take away from him: his education. His guardians ensured he received a good education, but more importantly, they encouraged discipline, responsibility, and independence. Those qualities would later become the invisible foundation of Rolex. Years later, people would admire Rolex for its precision, its consistency, its patience. Few realized those same values were first developed in the life of its founder. As Hans grew older, he developed an unusual curiosity about international trade. While many young men dreamed of secure government jobs, or following traditional careers, Hans was fascinated by business. He wanted to understand how products moved across countries, why some companies became famous, while others disappeared, why customers trusted certain brands, even when cheaper alternatives existed. These questions stayed with him. And without realizing it, he was already thinking like an entrepreneur. His first professional opportunity came in Switzerland. At the time, Switzerland was already earning a reputation for producing some of the world's finest watch movements. Hans found work with a company involved in exporting watches. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary office job. But for Hans, it became a classroom. Every shipment, every customer, every conversation taught him something new about the watch industry. He learned how watches were manufactured, how they were distributed, how international trade worked, and perhaps most importantly, he learned what customers actually valued. Most people assumed they were buying metal, gears, and craftsmanship. Hans saw something different. People weren't just buying a product. They were buying confidence. They wanted reliability. They wanted quality. And they wanted a name they could trust. That observation would later become one of the most valuable business lessons in modern branding. Because companies don't build billion-dollar empires by selling products alone. They build them by earning trust. But there was another discovery that completely changed Hans's thinking. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world didn't take wristwatches seriously. Pocket watches dominated the market. Businessmen carried them proudly. Railway workers depended on them. For most people, a proper timepiece belonged inside a pocket. Wristwatches were considered too small, too fragile, too unreliable. Many even described them as fashionable accessories rather than serious instruments. Almost everyone believed pocket watches represented the future. Hans disagreed. Where others saw limitations, he saw opportunity. He imagined a future where people could simply raise their wrist, instead of reaching into a pocket. It sounds obvious today, but at the time, it was a bold idea. History often celebrates successful products. What it rarely celebrates is the courage required to believe in an idea before anyone else does. Hans wasn't following the market. He was trying to change it. And changing markets is one of the hardest things any entrepreneur can do. Most businesses compete for existing customers. Visionary businesses create entirely new habits. Without realizing it, Hans had already identified the opportunity that would define his life. But believing in an idea and building a company around it are two very different challenges. He still had no famous brand, no factory, no fortune, no investors waiting to support him, only a vision that almost nobody shared. Yet sometimes, the biggest businesses in history begin with one simple question. What if everyone else is wrong? For Hans Wilsdorf, that question would change everything. Because his next decision wouldn't just create a new watch company. It would create one of the most recognizable brands the world has ever seen. London. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was one of the world's busiest business capitals. Trade flowed through its ports. New companies were being born almost every day. For ambitious entrepreneurs, it was a city filled with opportunity. For Hans Wilsdorf, it was the perfect place to test an idea that almost nobody believed in. In 1905, he partnered with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis, and started a small company. It wasn't a factory. It wasn't a luxury brand. In fact, they didn't manufacture watches at all. Their business was surprisingly simple. They imported high-quality Swiss watch movements, placed them inside carefully selected cases, and sold them to jewelers across Britain. At first glance, it looked like hundreds of other trading businesses. But Hans wasn't thinking like a trader. He was thinking like a brand builder. And that difference changed everything. While studying the market, Hans noticed something most people ignored. Customers remembered the name of the jewelry store where they bought the watch, but almost never remembered who actually made it. The manufacturer stayed invisible. The retailer received all the recognition. For many companies, that wasn't a problem. For Hans, it was the biggest opportunity of his career. He believed something revolutionary. One day, people wouldn't buy watches because of the shop. They would buy them because of the brand. Today, that idea feels completely normal. Apple, Nike, Louis Vuitton. People trust the brand before they even touch the product. But in the early 1900s, this way of thinking was almost unheard of in the watch industry. Most manufacturers focused on craftsmanship. Hans focused on identity. He wasn't asking, "How can I make another watch?" He was asking, "How can I create a name people will never forget?" That single question became the foundation of Rolex. But creating a global brand starts with something incredibly small. A name. Hans wanted a name that could be pronounced in every language. It had to be short, easy to remember, easy to print on a watch dial, and powerful enough to stand on its own. After countless ideas, one name stayed with him: Rolex. Nobody knows with complete certainty how the name was created. Hans himself offered different explanations over the years. One story suggested the word simply sounded right. Another claimed it resembled the sound of winding a watch. Whatever the true origin, the result was brilliant. 6 letters. Easy to pronounce. Impossible to confuse. More importantly, it didn't belong to any country. Rolex could travel anywhere in the world. That wasn't luck. It was branding. Long before companies spent billions creating global identities, Hans understood that people remember simple names. A complicated product can still become successful if the brand is unforgettable. But even the perfect name wasn't enough. There was still a much bigger problem. Almost nobody trusted wristwatches. Pocket watches dominated the market. Businessmen believed they were more accurate. Military officers relied on them. Engineers preferred them. A wristwatch was often dismissed as delicate. Some even considered it a piece of jewelry rather than a serious instrument. Imagine trying to build a billion-dollar company around a product most customers didn't respect. Many entrepreneurs would have abandoned the idea. Hans did the opposite. Instead of changing his vision, he decided to change public opinion. And changing public opinion requires something stronger than advertising. It requires proof. This became one of the smartest business decisions in Rolex's history. Rather than telling people his watches were accurate, Hans wanted independent experts to prove it. Because trust created by someone else is far more powerful than trust created by your own advertisements. That idea still shapes modern marketing today. Reviews, certifications, awards, customer testimonials. They all follow the same principle. People believe evidence more than promises. Hans understood this decades before it became standard business practice. Slowly, Rolex watches began earning official precision certificates, something very few wristwatches had achieved at the time. Those certificates did far more than improve sales. They changed perception. For the first time, people started seeing wristwatches as reliable instruments, instead of fashionable accessories. It was a turning point, not only for Rolex, but for the entire watch industry. Yet Hans wasn't satisfied. Accuracy alone wouldn't create a luxury empire. Customers still had another fear: water, dust, everyday life itself. Early wristwatches were vulnerable. A little moisture, a little dirt, and the movement inside could fail. Hans knew that if people were going to wear watches every single day, they had to survive the real world. Solving that problem would require one of the boldest engineering projects the watch industry had ever seen. And the innovation that followed wouldn't just make Rolex famous. It would become one of the greatest marketing campaigns in business history. A great product can make a company successful, but a great story can make a brand unforgettable. Hans Wilsdorf understood that better than almost anyone else. By the mid-1920s, Rolex had already proven that wristwatches could be accurate. But accuracy alone wasn't enough. People still had one major concern. Could a wristwatch survive everyday life? Back then, watches were incredibly delicate. A little dust, a little moisture, or even a sudden change in temperature could damage the movement inside. For many people, this was the biggest reason they continued carrying pocket watches. Hans knew that if Rolex wanted to dominate the future, it couldn't simply make a better watch. It had to eliminate every excuse people had for not wearing one. That challenge led to one of the most important innovations in watchmaking history. In 1926, Rolex introduced the Oyster, the world's first commercially successful waterproof and dust-proof wristwatch. At first, people were skeptical. Anyone could claim their product was waterproof. But claims don't build trust. Proof does. And Hans Wilsdorf wasn't interested in making promises. He wanted the entire world to witness the proof. Instead of spending millions on traditional advertising, he created something far more powerful. An unforgettable story. In 1927, a young British swimmer named Mercedes Gleitze attempted to swim across the English Channel. It was one of the toughest endurance challenges of its time. Hans saw an opportunity that no one else noticed. He asked Mercedes to wear a Rolex Oyster around her neck during the swim. Hour after hour, she battled freezing water, strong currents, and exhaustion. When she finally completed the journey, people expected the watch to be ruined. Instead, it was still ticking perfectly. The story made headlines. Newspapers across Britain published the remarkable achievement. Rolex even celebrated the event with a full-page newspaper advertisement. But here's the fascinating part. Hans wasn't really selling a waterproof watch. He was selling confidence. People didn't remember the engineering. They remembered the story. This became one of the earliest and most brilliant examples of what we now call story-driven marketing. Even today, the world's biggest brands follow the same formula. They don't simply advertise products. They create moments that people remember. Apple launches products through unforgettable events. Nike tells stories of athletes overcoming impossible odds. Tesla rarely relies on traditional advertising at all. Rolex was doing something remarkably similar, almost a century earlier. And it worked. Sales increased. Trust grew stronger. The Rolex name spread across the world. But Hans wasn't finished. While competitors focused on producing more watches, he focused on increasing the value of every watch he produced. This was the beginning of Rolex's most powerful business philosophy.
Scarcity. Most companies believe success comes from selling as many products as possible. Rolex believed something completely different. If everyone could own one, it would no longer feel special. Instead of flooding the market, Rolex carefully controlled production. Every watch was built with extraordinary attention to detail. Every retailer received limited inventory. Every customer felt they were buying something rare. And rarity creates desire. It's a simple psychological principle. The harder something is to obtain, the more valuable it becomes in the human mind. Rolex wasn't just manufacturing watches anymore. It was manufacturing exclusivity. That's why decades later, people still celebrate the day they finally receive a Rolex. Not because they bought a watch, but because they earned something difficult to obtain. That emotional experience is priceless. And priceless experiences create premium brands. Today, business schools around the world study this strategy. But Hans Wilsdorf was practicing it long before the term luxury branding became popular. He understood something timeless. Luxury isn't created by expensive materials alone. Luxury is created by perception, by trust, by consistency, and by making customers feel they belong to something exclusive. That philosophy transformed Rolex from a respected watchmaker into a global symbol of achievement. But perhaps the greatest surprise was still waiting. Most billion-dollar companies eventually become controlled by billionaire families, corporate investors, or stock markets. Rolex chose an entirely different path, one that almost no luxury brand has ever followed. And that decision may be the biggest business secret behind its success. Because even after Hans Wilsdorf was gone, his vision continued exactly as he intended. No billionaire owner, no shareholders demanding short-term profits, no pressure to sacrifice quality for quarterly earnings. Instead, the company remained focused on one thing: protecting the Rolex name for generations to come. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson every entrepreneur can learn. Products can be copied, Factories can be rebuilt. Technology can be replaced. But trust, once earned over decades, becomes almost impossible for competitors to steal. Rolex didn't build a billion-dollar empire by chasing every customer. It built one by creating something people were willing to wait for. And in today's world, that may be the rarest luxury of all.
Rolex never became a billion-dollar empire by making the most watches. It became a billion-dollar empire by making people believe that owning one was worth waiting for. For more than a century, the company has protected one thing above everything else. Not profits, not trends, and not even sales, but its reputation. That's why a Rolex is far more than just a luxury watch. It represents trust, patience, craftsmanship, status, and a legacy that has been built over generations. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson every entrepreneur can learn. The world's greatest businesses don't become successful by chasing customers. They become successful by creating something so valuable that customers willingly chase them. Now, I'd love to hear your opinion. Do you believe Rolex truly deserves its premium price because of its craftsmanship and heritage, or do you think its success is driven mainly by one of the greatest marketing and branding strategies ever created? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below because I genuinely love to read your perspective. And if you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover the untold business stories behind the world's biggest brands, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.